In the shadow of eternity, where golden sands hold the whispers of gods and the footsteps of kings echo through corridors of time, there lived a child who would become legend. Before the great temples rose to touch the heavens, before the chariot wheels carved their thunder across distant battlefields, before the very stones would sing his name across 3 millennia, there was only the soft breath of a newborn, cradled in the arms of destiny. The Nile had seen pharaohs rise and fall like the rhythm of its own sacred floods, yet none would cast a shadow as long or as profound as the one born in the 3rd year of Seti's reign. Here, in the quiet moments before greatness awakens, begins the story of Ramses, he who would be called the Great, whose name would outlive empires, and whose legacy would sleep eternal in the heart of the desert, waiting for curious souls to discover what it truly means to touch immortality. If this journey into history moves you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Let timeless stories find new hearts, just like yours. The year was 1303 before the Common Era, when the great river Nile flowed as it had for countless generations, carrying with it the fertile black soil that would nourish not only the crops of Egypt but the dreams of empire. In the royal palace of Memphis, where the shadows of ancient pyramids stretched across courtyards adorned with lotus columns and painted walls that told stories of gods walking among mortals, Queen Tuya felt the first stirrings of life that would change the course of history. She was the beloved wife of Seti I, a pharaoh whose own rise to power had been as swift as it was unexpected. The family that would produce the greatest of all pharaohs had not been born to royalty they had seized it through strength, wisdom, and the favor of the gods. Seti's father, the first Ramses, had been a military commander and vizier under the pharaoh Horemheb, a man whose loyalty and strategic mind had elevated him from common birth to the throne of the 2 lands. It was a reminder that in Egypt, greatness could emerge from any quarter, like the sun rising unexpectedly over the eastern hills when the child was born. The priests who attended the birth declared that he had come into the world under auspicious signs. The sun god Ra, they proclaimed, had blessed this child with his golden light, and thus he was given the name Ramesses, meaning born of Ra. Even as an infant, there was something in his eyes, a clarity, an intensity that spoke of destiny waiting to unfold. The young prince bore the features that would become legendary, the prominent nose that would appear on countless statues, the firm jaw that would be carved into the living rock of mountainsides, and even in childhood, a bearing that suggested he had been shaped by the gods themselves for great purposes. Queen Tuya, holding her son in the cool shadows of the palace nursery, could not have known that she cradled the future builder of Abu Simbel, the commander who would face the greatest military alliance the ancient world had ever seen, the pharaoh who would live longer than any in Egypt's history save one. But perhaps, in the quiet moments of early morning when she watched him sleep, she sensed something of the magnitude that lay dormant in this small form. The ancient Egyptians believed that a person's name held power over their fate, and in naming him for the sun god, they had unconsciously prophesied the blazing brilliance that would mark his path through history. Seti I was a pharaoh consumed with the restoration of Egypt's empire. During the chaotic years that had preceded his dynasty, Egypt had lost much of its influence over the lands beyond its borders. The great empire that had once stretched from Nubia in the south to the Euphrates in the north had contracted, and foreign powers had grown bold in challenging Egyptian authority. Seti had taken the throne with the determination to restore his nation's glory, and he understood that this restoration would require not only his own efforts, but the training of a successor who could continue and surpass his work from his earliest years. Young Ramesses was immersed in the world of kingship. The palace was not merely a home but a school where every wall, every ceremony, every daily ritual taught lessons about the nature of divine rule. He watched as his father held court, observing how Seti balanced the competing demands of high priests, military commanders, regional governors, and foreign ambassadors. The child learned to read the subtle language of power, how a raised eyebrow could silence a room, how the positioning of one's body could communicate strength or openness, how the careful choice of words could turn potential enemies into allies. The education of a crown prince in the 19th dynasty was comprehensive and demanding. Ramesses learned to read and write the sacred hieroglyphs, understanding that knowledge of the divine script was essential for communicating with the gods and maintaining the cosmic order that kept Egypt prosperous. He studied mathematics, for a pharaoh must understand the complex calculations involved in taxation, irrigation, and architectural projects. Geography became his constant companion, as he memorized the locations of Egypt's temples, fortresses, and administrative centers, as well as the territories beyond Egypt's borders that his father hoped to reclaim. But perhaps most importantly, he learned the art of war. Seti I was determined that his son would be no palace scholar, content to rule from behind palace walls. Egypt's empire had been built by warrior pharaohs, and it would be maintained only by those willing to take up sword and bow in defense of the cosmic principle of truth, justice, and order that the pharaoh was sworn to uphold. Even as a young boy, Ramesses was taught to handle weapons, to ride the war chariots that were Egypt's military pride, and to understand the strategies and tactics that had made Egypt master of the known world. The young prince's training extended beyond the purely practical to encompass the spiritual dimensions of kingship. He spent long hours in the temples, learning the prayers and rituals that would one day be his responsibility to perform. The pharaoh was not merely a political leader, but the living embodiment of Horus on earth, the intermediary between the divine and mortal realms. Every ritual he would perform, every temple he would build, every offering he would make would serve to maintain the delicate balance that kept the Nile flooding regularly, kept the sun rising each morning, and kept chaos at bay. As Ramesses grew, from child to youth, his exceptional capabilities became increasingly apparent. His tutors marveled at his ability to master complex texts, his natural skill with weapons, and his intuitive understanding of the arts of leadership. But more than intellectual gifts, he possessed that rarest of qualities in a future ruler, the ability to inspire others. Servants in the palace spoke of his kindness and fairness. Guards reported his courage and physical prowess. Even foreign dignitaries who met the young prince came away impressed by his bearing and wisdom. When Ramesses reached his 14th year, Seti, I made a decision that would prove crucial to his son's development. Rather than keeping the crown prince in the comfortable confines of the palace, he began taking him on military campaigns. The boy who had learned war from scrolls and practice courts would now see the reality of battle, diplomacy, and the harsh demands of command. This was not mere indulgence of a father's pride in his son. It was the calculated preparation of a future pharaoh for the challenges that awaited him. Their first campaign together took them north into Canaan, where Egyptian control had weakened during the years of political instability. The young Ramesses rode beside his father as they crossed the desert border, seeing for the first time the vast expanse of territories that Egypt claimed as its own. He witnessed the diplomatic negotiations with local rulers, some of whom submitted peacefully to renewed Egyptian authority, while others required more forceful persuasion. Most importantly, he observed how his father balanced firmness with mercy, understanding that lasting control required not merely the ability to conquer, but the wisdom to rule effectively once conquest was complete. The campaign was a success, restoring Egyptian influence over several key cities and trade routes. But for Ramesses, the greatest victory was the confidence he gained in his own abilities and the deepening of his understanding of what it meant to be pharaoh. He had seen how the mere presence of the king could change the balance of power in a region, how the symbols and rituals of kingship carried weight far beyond their material substance, and how the successful ruler must be simultaneously warrior, priest, judge, and diplomat. Upon their return to Egypt, Seti began to delegate more responsibilities to his son. Ramesses was given charge of certain administrative districts, allowing him to learn the practical aspects of governing a complex civilization. He dealt with disputes between farmers over water rights, arbitrated conflicts between different temple hierarchies, and oversaw the collection of taxes and tribute from Egypt's various provinces. These experiences, mundane as they might seem compared to the glory of military conquest, provided invaluable preparation for the realities of pharaonic rule. As his 18th birthday approached, Ramesses had grown into a figure who commanded respect and admiration throughout Egypt, standing tall and powerfully built, with the characteristic features that would one day be carved into monuments throughout his empire. He embodied the ideal of pharaonic majesty. His voice carried the authority that came from years of training and experience, yet it retained the warmth that made him beloved by those who served under him. Foreign ambassadors who met him reported back to their own rulers that Egypt's next pharaoh would be a formidable leader, but Ramesses' preparation for kingship involved more than military campaigns and administrative duties. Seti, I understood that a pharaoh needed a queen who could serve not merely as a royal wife, but as a partner in the great work of ruling Egypt. The choice of royal consorts was always a matter of both personal affection and political calculation, and in this crucial decision, fate and wisdom combined to provide Ramesses with one of history's most remarkable queens. Nefertari entered Ramesses' life during his 19th year, and from their first meeting, it was clear that this was more than a conventional royal marriage. She possessed not only the beauty that Egyptian art would later celebrate in the exquisite paintings of her tomb, but also the intelligence, wisdom, and strength of character that would make her an indispensable partner in the great enterprises that lay ahead. Their courtship, conducted under the watchful eyes of the court, and in accordance with the elaborate protocols of royal romance, was marked by a mutual respect and growing affection that would endure throughout their lives. Nefertari came from a noble family with deep roots in Upper Egypt, bringing with her not only personal qualities, but also political connections that would strengthen Ramses' position when he assumed the throne. Her education had been as thorough as his own, though focused on the particular skills and knowledge that would make her an effective queen. She understood the religious ceremonies in which she would participate, the diplomatic functions she would fulfill, and the cultural patronage that would be expected of her. More than this, she possessed the rare ability to serve as a trusted advisor, someone whose counsel Ramses would value throughout his reign. Their marriage, celebrated with ceremonies that combined personal joy with state pageantry, marked another crucial step in Ramses' preparation for kingship. As a married man with the prospect of heirs, he gained additional gravitas in the eyes of both his subjects and foreign rulers. The elaborate wedding festivities, lasting for days and involving delegations from throughout Egypt's empire, served as a demonstration of the dynasty's stability and the bright prospects for the future. In the year 1279, before the Common Era, when Ramses had reached his 24th year, the moment arrived that had been prepared for throughout his life. Seti, after a reign marked by military success and internal consolidation, felt the weight of advancing years and the satisfaction of having restored Egypt's position as the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean. He had accomplished what he had set out to do, and he had prepared his son to continue and surpass his achievements. The transition of power, when it came, was smooth and dignified. Seti, I had the rare satisfaction of seeing his life's work placed in capable hands, and Ramses had the equally rare advantage of ascending to the throne with the full support of the military, the priesthood, and the administrative apparatus of the state. The coronation ceremonies, held in the great temple of Ptah at Memphis, were attended by representatives from throughout the known world, all coming to witness the beginning of what many already sensed would be an extraordinary reign. As the golden crown of Upper and Lower Egypt was placed upon his head, as the crook and flail symbols of a pharaoh's duty to guide and protect his people were placed in his hands, Ramses felt the full weight of destiny settling upon his shoulders. He was no longer simply the crown prince learning to rule. He was Pharaoh, the living Horus, the son of Ra, the guardian of Mat. Everything in his life had led to this moment, and everything that would follow would flow from the decisions he made and the character he displayed as king. The early years of Ramses' reign were marked by a combination of consolidation and expansion that demonstrated his mastery of the lessons his father had taught him. He understood that a new pharaoh must prove himself worthy of the throne, not through grand gestures, but through effective governance and military success. His first campaigns, launched into Nubia to the south, were carefully planned operations designed not merely to gather tribute, but to demonstrate that the new pharaoh was as capable a warrior as his father had been. These early Nubian campaigns revealed the tactical brilliance that would make Ramses one of history's great military commanders. Rather than simply overwhelming his enemies through superior numbers, he employed sophisticated strategies that minimized Egyptian casualties, while maximizing the psychological impact of his victories. His use of combined infantry, chariot, and archer formations showed an understanding of military science that went far beyond the traditional Egyptian approach of charging forward with overwhelming force. But even more impressive than his military skills was Ramesses' understanding of how to transform military victory into lasting political control. After defeating Nubian resistance, he implemented administrative reforms that bound the southern territories more closely to Egypt while respecting local customs and traditions. He appointed capable governors, many of them drawn from the local population, and established a system of tribute that was heavy enough to benefit Egypt without being so oppressive as to provoke rebellion. As word of these early successes spread throughout the ancient world, other rulers began to take notice of Egypt's new pharaoh. In the courts of Babylon, Assyria, and most importantly, the Hittite Empire, advisors warned their kings that a formidable new player had emerged on the stage of international politics. The young pharaoh who had succeeded Seti I was clearly not content to maintain the status quo he had. Ambitions that would inevitably bring him into conflict with other great powers. During these early years of his reign, Ramesses also began the building projects that would become his most visible legacy. Understanding that a pharaoh's greatness was measured not only by his military conquests, but by the monuments he left behind, he initiated the construction of temples, statues, and architectural complexes on a scale that dwarfed the works of his predecessors. The principles that would guide these projects, the emphasis on colossal scale, the integration of religious and political symbolism, the use of architecture to project power across time and space, were established during these formative years of his kingship. His first major architectural undertaking was the completion and expansion of his father's building projects, demonstrating both filial piety and the continuity of the dynasty. But even as he honored his father's memory through these works, Ramesses was planning projects that would be entirely his own, monuments that would proclaim his individual greatness to future generations. The site that would become Abu Simbel was already in his thoughts, though the great temples there would not begin to rise for several more years. Perhaps most significantly, these early years of Ramesses' reign saw the establishment of the personal style and approach to kingship that would characterize his entire 66-year rule. He combined the traditional elements of pharaonic authority, the religious ceremonies, the court rituals, the symbolic regalia, with innovations that reflected his own personality and the particular challenges of his time. His court became known for its magnificence, but also for its efficiency. His administration was elaborate but effective. His approach to foreign relations mixed diplomacy with the credible threat of military force. By his 5th year on the throne, Ramesses had established himself as a pharaoh worthy to stand among Egypt's greatest rulers. His early campaigns had secured Egypt's borders and extended its influence. His building projects had begun to transform the landscape of the Nile Valley. His administrative reforms had strengthened the kingdom's internal structure. Most importantly, he had demonstrated the combination of military prowess, political wisdom, and personal charisma that would make him a figure of legendary proportions. Yet for all his early successes, Ramesses knew that the greatest challenges of his reign lay ahead, to the north, in the mountains of Anatolia. The Hittite Empire was gathering its strength under the leadership of Muwatalli II, a king whose ambitions matched those of the young pharaoh. The two greatest powers of the ancient world were on a collision course that would culminate in one of history's most famous battles and, eventually, in the world's first recorded peace treaty, as the sun set over the Nile at the end of Ramesses' fifth regnal year, casting long shadows across the monuments he was already beginning to build. The young pharaoh stood on the roof of his palace and gazed toward the northern horizon. He had achieved much in his first years as king, but he understood that his true destiny lay in the conflicts and triumphs that awaited him. The boy born of Ra had become a man capable of changing the course of history, and history was waiting to see what he would make of the power that the gods had placed in his hands. The stage was set for the greatest drama of the ancient world, and its leading actor was ready to make his entrance upon the theatre of eternity. The young pharaoh's hands gripped the reins of his chariot as the morning sun cast long shadows across the desert. In the second year of his reign, Ramses II stood at the crossroads of destiny, his amber eyes fixed upon the northern horizons where enemies of Egypt dwelt. The blood of warriors coursed through his veins, inherited from Seti, yet tempered with the wisdom of kingship that had been carefully cultivated since his earliest days as crown prince. The Nubian campaigns came first, like thunder rolling across the southern reaches of his empire. These were not mere expeditions of conquest, but declarations of divine authority that echoed from the cataracts of the Nile to the golden mines of Kush. His armies moved like the flooding river itself, inexorable and life-giving, carrying the power of Egypt deep into lands that had known Egyptian rule for generations, but had grown restless in recent years. In the scorching heat of the Nubian desert, Ramses learned the weight of command. He watched his soldiers march across endless dunes, their bronze armor gleaming like scales of some great serpent, their footsteps creating a rhythm that seemed to match the eternal heartbeat of Egypt itself. The young pharaoh rode among them, not as a distant god-king, but as a leader who shared their hardships and understood their hopes. The fortress of Amara fell to his forces like a flower closing at sunset. The defenders, seeing the approaching Egyptian army with its forest of spears and its countless chariots, surrendered rather than face the wrath of the pharaoh. Yet Ramses showed mercy where his predecessors might have shown only strength. He understood that true power lay not in the destruction of enemies, but in their transformation into allies. His scribes recorded every detail of these early campaigns, their reed pens scratching across papyrus scrolls that would preserve the young pharaoh's deeds for millennia. They wrote of his courage in battle, his wisdom in negotiation, and his mercy toward the defeated. But they could not capture the loneliness that sometimes filled his heart as he stood in his tent at night, gazing at the stars and wondering what challenges tomorrow would bring. The Nubian gold that flowed northward following these victories became the foundation for grander dreams. Ramses saw in those gleaming ingots not merely wealth, but possibility. He envisioned temples that would dwarf the pyramids, cities that would shine like jewels along the Nile, and monuments that would carry his name across the endless expanse of time. Word of the pharaoh's success traveled swiftly across the ancient world, carried by merchants and diplomats who spoke in hushed tones of the young king's military prowess. In the courts of distant kingdoms, rulers took note of this rising power. The Hittite emperor, Muwatalli II, seated in his mountain fortress far to the north, received reports of Egyptian victories with growing concern. The balance of power in the ancient Near East was shifting like sand in the desert wind, and both great empires understood that conflict was inevitable. For generations, Egypt and the Hittite Empire had danced around each other like two great cats circling the same territory, sometimes clashing, sometimes maintaining an uneasy peace, but always watching, always waiting. As the 4th year of his reign approached, Ramses found himself drawn inexorably toward the greatest challenge of his young life. The city of Kadesh, perched on the Orontes River in what is now Syria, had become a symbol of the struggle between Egyptian and Hittite ambitions. This ancient fortress city, with its strategic position controlling the trade routes between Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean, represented far more than mere territory. The pharaoh's war council gathered in the great hall of Memphis, their voices echoing off walls decorated with paintings of Egypt's military triumphs. Maps carved into stone showed the disposition of forces, the mountain passes that armies must traverse, and the rivers that could become either highways or barriers. Ramses studied these charts with the intensity of a scholar reading sacred texts, understanding that the fate of his empire might hang upon the decisions made in this room. His generals, veterans of countless campaigns, spoke of supply lines and siege tactics, of chariots and infantry formations. But Ramses saw something deeper in their preparations. This would be more than a military campaign. It would be a test of his divine mandate to rule. The gods of Egypt would judge their chosen pharaoh in the crucible of battle, and all the ancient world would witness the verdict. The army that assembled for the Kadesh campaign was unlike any force Egypt had ever fielded. For great divisions, each named for a god who would guide and protect them, converged from across the kingdom. The division of Ammon, led by Ramses himself, comprised the elite troops of Upper Egypt. The division of Ra gathered the skilled archers and charioteers of Memphis. The division of Ptah brought the sturdy infantrymen of the Delta, while the division of Seth mustered the fierce warriors of the eastern frontier. 20,000 soldiers marched northward in the spring of his 5th regnal year. Their feet raising clouds of dust that could be seen from horizon to horizon. The sound of their movement was like distant thunder, a rumbling that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Ramses rode at their head in his golden chariot, his royal serpent gleaming on his brow, his heart filled with the confidence of youth and the weight of destiny. The journey took them through the sun-baked wilderness of Sinai, across landscapes that had witnessed the passage of armies since the dawn of recorded history. They marched past ancient wells where Abraham had watered his flocks, through wadis where Moses had wandered with the children of Israel, along paths that Alexander would one day follow on his own march toward immortality. As they traveled, Ramses felt the eyes of history upon him. He was no longer merely a young pharaoh seeking to prove himself, but a link in the eternal chain of Egyptian kings, who had carried their empire's power beyond the borders of the sacred Nile. The responsibility was crushing, yet exhilarating. Every step brought him closer to the moment when his name would be written in the annals of the great or forgotten in the dust of failure. The army made camp near the Lebanese coast, within sight of the snow-capped peaks of Mount Lebanon. Here, in the shadow of those ancient mountains, Ramses received his final intelligence reports about Hittite movements. The enemy was gathering, his spies reported, but their numbers remained uncertain. Some spoke of modest forces, while others whispered of a great host that included not only Hittites but allies from across Anatolia and Syria. The pharaoh stood alone in his tent that final night before the march to Kadesh, his hands resting on a map that showed the convergence of destiny. Outside, his soldiers slept beneath the stars, their dreams perhaps filled with visions of home and victory. But Ramses remained wakeful, pondering the magnitude of what lay ahead. He thought of his father Seti, who had dreamed of crushing Hittite power but had died before achieving that goal. He thought of his grandfather Ramses I, who had founded their dynasty on the promise of military glory. He thought of the long line of pharaohs stretching back to Menes, who had first united the two lands, and he wondered whether he would prove worthy of their legacy. The night air carried the scent of cedar. From the distant mountains, mixed with the smoke of countless campfires, somewhere in the darkness, a soldier was singing a hymn to Amen, his voice soft and melodic, like a prayer carried on the wind. The sound seemed to encapsulate everything that Ramses fought to protect: the simple faith of his people, their trust in their God-King, their hope for a future free from the shadow of foreign domination. Dawn broke grey and ominous over the ancient city of Kadesh as the Egyptian army approached its destiny. The fortress rose from the banks of the Orontes like a man-made mountain, its walls scarred by centuries of warfare, its towers watching silently as the greatest military drama of the Bronze Age began to unfold. Ramses, now 25 years old and in the prime of his physical power, felt the weight of kingship settle upon his shoulders like a mantle of stars. The division of Amen, with the pharaoh at its head, had crossed the river and was making camp near the city when the first deception revealed itself. To Bedouin scouts, their robes dusty from travel, their eyes filled with apparent sincerity, approached the Egyptian lines with news that would change the course of the battle before it had even begun. "Great Pharaoh," they said, bowing low before Ramses' chariot, "we bring word from the north. The coward Mu'tali has fled before your mighty army. The Hittite forces have withdrawn far to the north, near Aleppo, trembling at the very mention of your name." The news spread through the Egyptian ranks like wildfire. Soldiers who had marched hundreds of miles in the heat of the Syrian sun suddenly found their steps lighter, their spirits soaring. The great confrontation they had prepared for seemed to have dissolved like morning mist before the rising sun of Egyptian power. But Ramses, though young, possessed the instincts of a born warrior. Something in the Bedouin's manner troubled him, a subtle wrongness that he could not quite identify. He ordered the men to be questioned more thoroughly, and under the persuasion of Egyptian soldiers, the truth began to emerge like blood from a wound. The Bedouins were not simple desert dwellers, but Hittite agents sent to deceive the Egyptian army into believing their enemies had fled. The reality was far more terrifying. Muwatalli's forces, numbering perhaps 37,000 men with 2,500 chariots, lay hidden just beyond the city, waiting in perfect ambush formation. As this revelation dawned, Ramses felt the cold touch of mortality brush against his soul. His army was strung out across miles of Syrian countryside. The division of Ammon isolated near Kadesh, while the other divisions followed hours behind. He had walked directly into a trap that could destroy not only his army, but the very foundation of Egyptian power in the east. The Hittite attack came like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. Chariots emerged from hidden positions in numbers that seemed to blot out the sun, their bronze-fitted wheels raising clouds of dust that turned day to twilight. The thunder of hooves and the war cries of warriors filled the air as the greatest chariot battle in ancient history began with devastating fury. The division of Ra, marching to join their pharaoh, was caught completely off guard. These seasoned veterans, who had faced Nubian warriors and Libyan raiders, found themselves overwhelmed by an enemy force that seemed to materialize from the very earth itself. Their formation shattered like pottery thrown against stone, and survivors fled southward carrying news of catastrophe. Ramses watched in horror as his carefully laid plans crumbled before his eyes. The pride of Egypt's army was being destroyed piece by piece, and he himself stood in mortal danger with only his personal guard and a few hundred chariots between him and annihilation. The weight of failure pressed down upon him like a crushing stone, yet in that moment of supreme crisis, something awakened within the young pharaoh that would define the rest of his long life. Whether it was the blood of warriors that flowed in his veins, the divine mandate that he believed made him the son of Ra, or simply the desperate courage of a cornered lion, Ramses found within himself reserves of strength he had never known existed. The transformation was witnessed by scribes who would later record it in temple walls across Egypt, their words becoming legend, their pharaoh's deed inspiring soldiers for generations yet unborn. Ramses called upon his divine father, Amen, with a prayer that seemed to rise from the depths of his soul. O Amen, my father, have I not made offerings to you? Have I not built monuments to your glory? Do not abandon your son in his hour of greatest need. I call upon you, and I shall trust in your protection, though I stand alone against a multitude. The prayer seemed to kindle something within him, a flame that burned away fear and doubt, leaving only the pure essence of royal will. Ramses grasped his weapons with hands that no longer trembled, his eyes blazing with a light that seemed to come from some divine source. The pharaoh who had entered the trap as a young man seeking glory emerged as something far more dangerous, a king fighting for the survival of his kingdom. What followed entered the realm of legend even as it unfolded. Before thousands of witnesses, Ramses, with only his personal guard and perhaps 50 chariots, charged directly into the massed ranks of the Hittite army. It was an act of such apparent madness that even his enemies paused in amazement, their formations wavering as they tried to comprehend what they were seeing. The pharaoh's chariot cut through the enemy ranks like a golden sword through darkness. His horses, bred for speed and trained for war, seemed to share their master's supernatural energy. His driver Mena held the reins with steady hands, while Ramses wielded his bow with deadly precision, his arrows finding their marks even as enemy weapons whistled past his head. Behind him, his guards fought with the desperation of men who knew their king's life hung in the balance. They formed a wedge of bronze and courage that carved a path through the Hittite host, their war cries echoing across the battlefield like the voices of avenging gods. The sight of their pharaoh leading from the front, risking everything for his kingdom, inspired them to deeds that would have seemed impossible under any other circumstances. The Hittite forces, caught off guard by the ferocity and unexpectedness of the Egyptian counterattack, began to fall back in confusion. Chariots that had moments before been pursuing fleeing Egyptians now found themselves under assault from an enemy who seemed to have risen from the dead. The tide of battle, which had seemed to flow inexorably toward Egyptian defeat, began to turn as the afternoon sun reached its zenith over the battlefield of Kadesh. The impossible began to seem merely unlikely. Ramses' desperate charge had achieved what careful strategy had failed to accomplish. It had thrown the Hittite army into disarray at the very moment of their greatest triumph. The pharaoh's chariot, surrounded by a growing circle of loyal warriors, became the eye of a hurricane that swept across the field of battle. The Hittite commander, Muwatalli's brother, had expected to be celebrating victory by this hour. Instead, he found himself struggling to maintain control of forces that should have been mopping up the remnants of Egyptian resistance. The sight of the pharaoh himself, fighting like a cornered lion in the midst of his enemies, was having an effect that went beyond mere military tactics. Ancient soldiers were deeply superstitious, and what they were witnessing seemed to confirm every legend they had ever heard about the divine nature of Egyptian pharaohs. Here was a king who called upon the gods and seemed to receive their answer, a ruler who faced impossible odds and somehow survived. The psychological impact was as devastating as any physical weapon, but divine intervention, if that was what it was, needed earthly assistance to achieve its full effect. That assistance came in the form of the Nefertari, an elite unit of Egyptian troops who had been stationed along the coast and now arrived at the crucial moment. Their appearance on the battlefield was like the arrival of the cavalry in some later age, a dramatic reversal that caught the Hittites completely by surprise. The Nefertari had force-marched across the Syrian countryside, driven by reports of disaster, and the desperate need to reach their pharaoh before it was too late. They arrived dusty and exhausted, but ready to fight, their bronze weapons gleaming in the afternoon sun, their war cries adding to the growing cacophony of battle. With these reinforcements, Ramses was able to expand his counterattack. The small circle of Egyptian resistance became a larger formation than a true battle line. What had begun as a desperate last stand was transforming into something that historians would later struggle to categorize. Not quite a victory, not quite a defeat, but certainly one of the most dramatic military reversals in ancient history. The Hittite forces, who had begun the day confident of crushing Egyptian power forever, now found themselves retreating toward the safety of Kadesh's walls. Their chariots, which had seemed invincible in the morning, were now vulnerable to Egyptian arrows and spears. The hunters had become the hunted, and the reversal was so complete that it seemed to confirm every story ever told about the pharaoh's divine protection. As evening approached, both armies drew apart like exhausted wrestlers stepping back from their grapple. The field between them was littered with the debris of war, broken chariots, scattered weapons, and the bodies of men who would never see another sunset. The great fortress of Kadesh loomed over the scene like a stone judge, its walls having witnessed the rise and fall of many kingdoms. Ramses stood in his chariot, his royal armor dented but intact, his eyes surveying the battlefield with the gaze of a man who had looked death in the face and lived to tell the tale. The pharaoh who had entered the battle that morning was gone, replaced by someone harder, wiser, and infinitely more dangerous. The trap at Kadesh had been intended to destroy him, but instead it had forged him like iron in a furnace. That night, as his army tended to its wounds and counted its losses, Ramses walked among his soldiers like a phantom. He stopped to speak with the injured, to comfort those who had lost friends, to listen to the stories of ordinary men who had performed extraordinary deeds. He was learning something that would serve him throughout his long reign. True kingship was not about commanding from a distance, but about sharing the burdens of those who served. The aftermath of Kadesh would be debated by historians for millennia. Both sides would claim victory, and in their own ways, both would be correct. The Hittites had failed to destroy Egyptian power, while the Egyptians had failed to capture the fortress they had come to take. But the real significance of the battle lay not in territory gained or lost, but in the transformation it had worked upon its participants. For Ramses, Kadesh marked the end of youth and the beginning of true kingship. He had faced the ultimate test of leadership and had not been found wanting. The courage he had shown, the quick thinking that had turned near disaster into stalemate, and the divine favor that had seemed to protect him would become the foundation of his legend. The armies eventually withdrew, each side carrying with it the knowledge that neither could easily defeat the other. The balance of power in the ancient Near East had not shifted decisively in either direction, but something more important had been established: mutual respect. The young pharaoh had proven himself worthy of the throne of Egypt, while the Hittite king had demonstrated that his empire could not be conquered by force alone. In the days that followed, as Egyptian forces made their way back toward the Nile, Ramses began to conceive of a different kind of victory. If war could not resolve the conflict between the two great powers, perhaps diplomacy could achieve what bronze and iron had failed to accomplish. The idea that would eventually lead to the world's first recorded peace treaty was beginning to take shape in the mind of a pharaoh who had learned that true strength sometimes lay in knowing when not to fight. The journey home was a time of reflection and planning. Ramses rode in his chariot through landscapes that seemed to shimmer with possibility, his mind already turning toward the great works he would undertake to commemorate not just his survival, but his transformation. The temples he would build would tell the story of Kadesh, not as a battle barely won, but as a divine triumph that confirmed his right to rule. As the Egyptian army crossed back into the delta, palm trees swaying in the evening breeze and the sacred Nile flowing eternally toward the sea, Ramses felt the weight of kingship settle upon his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a mantle of destiny. The trap at Kadesh had been intended to end his reign before it truly began. Instead, It had marked the beginning of one of the most remarkable reigns in all of ancient history. Years flowed like the Nile after Kadesh, bringing with them the wisdom that comes only from experience and the patience that follows youth's first encounter with mortality. Ramses, now in his 30s, had grown into the pharaoh that destiny had always intended him to become. The impetuosity of youth had been tempered by the weight of kingship, yet the fire that had burned within him at Kadesh continued to illuminate his reign like a beacon across the centuries. The palace at Pi-Ramesses, his great new capital in the Delta, had become the hub of a diplomatic revolution. Messengers arrived daily from kingdoms across the known world, their papyrus scrolls bearing news of treaties, trade agreements, and marriage proposals. Egypt under Ramses was not withdrawing from the world, but engaging with it in ways that previous pharaohs had never imagined. The breakthrough came in his 21st regnal year, when a Hittite delegation arrived in Egypt bearing gifts that spoke of respect rather than submission. Their leader, a grizzled veteran of many campaigns, carried with him a silver tablet inscribed with cuneiform script that would change the course of history. This was the first draft of what would become the Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty, a document so revolutionary that its echoes would resonate through the ages. Ramses received the delegation in the great hall of his palace, seated upon the golden throne of his ancestors, the double crown of Egypt gleaming upon his brow. But the pharaoh who faced the Hittite ambassadors was not the young warrior who had charged into battle at Kadesh. This was a mature ruler who understood that true strength lay not in the ability to destroy one's enemies, but in the wisdom to transform them into allies. The negotiations that followed were conducted with a sophistication that belied the common perception of ancient diplomacy as crude and simple. Both sides understood that they were creating something unprecedented, a treaty between equals, a recognition that two great powers could coexist without one dominating the other. The clauses they hammered out covered everything from mutual defense to the extradition of refugees, creating a framework for peace that would last for generations. When the final version of the treaty was completed, it was inscribed not only on silver tablets, but carved into the walls of temples throughout Egypt. Ramses wanted his people to understand that this was not merely a temporary truce, but a new way of conducting international relations. The pharaoh who had once sought glory in battle was now finding it in the pursuit of lasting peace. The treaty was sealed with ceremonies that blended Egyptian and Hittite traditions, creating rituals that seemed to bind not just the two kingdoms, but the very gods they worshipped. Ramses participated in these ceremonies with a solemnity that spoke of his understanding of their historical significance. He was not merely signing a document, he was helping to create a new era in human history. The peace with the Hittites freed Egyptian resources for other pursuits, and Ramses turned his attention to the great building projects that would become his lasting legacy. The pharaoh who had once dreamed of military conquest now envisioned monuments that would outlast any victory, temples that would speak of Egyptian glory when the memory of battles had faded into dust. Abu symbol, carved into the living rock of Nubia, began to take shape under his direction. The great temple, with its 4 colossal statues of the pharaoh gazing eternally toward the rising sun, was conceived not as a mere monument to royal ego, but as a statement of Egyptian power that would awe visitors for millennia. Each statue stood 65 feet tall, their faces wearing expressions of serene confidence that seemed to embody the pharaoh's own transformation from warrior to king. The work on Abu Simbel proceeded with Egyptian efficiency and artistry. Skilled craftsmen from across the kingdom labored in the Nubian heat, their chisels gradually revealing the pharaoh's vision from the stubborn stone. The temple's interior was designed to capture the first rays of the sun on Ramses' birthday and coronation day, a feat of engineering, an astronomy that spoke of the sophisticated knowledge possessed by Egyptian architects. But Abu Simbel was only the beginning. Throughout his kingdom, Ramses commissioned temples, statues, and obelisks that proclaimed the glory of Egypt and the favor of the gods. Pi-Ramesses itself became a wonder of the ancient world, its palaces and temples reflecting the wealth that flowed from trade routes now protected by peace, rather than threatened by war. The pharaoh's attention to domestic affairs during this period revealed another facet of his complex personality. He was not content merely to build monuments to his own glory. He sought to improve the lives of his subjects in practical ways. Irrigation projects brought fertility to previously barren lands, while new administrative systems ensured that justice and prosperity reached even the humblest villages along the Nile. As his reign entered its fourth decade, Ramses began to contemplate the question of succession with the same careful attention he had given to diplomacy and architecture. His many sons by various wives represented both the blessing and the burden of his prolific family life. The pharaoh who had once been concerned primarily with his own survival now found himself planning for a future he might not live to see. The royal court had grown into a complex institution during his reign, with princes and princesses, high priests and viziers, all vying for influence and position. Ramses navigated these treacherous waters with the same skill he had once shown on the battlefield, understanding that internal harmony was as important to Egypt's strength as any external alliance. His relationship with Nefertari, his beloved queen, provided an anchor of stability in the turbulent sea of court politics. She had grown from the young princess he had married into a woman of remarkable wisdom and influence, her own monuments at Abu Simbel standing as testament to the respect and love her husband bore for her. Their partnership had become legendary throughout the ancient world, a model of royal marriage that combined political necessity with genuine affection. The Queen's tomb in the Valley of the Queens, when it was finally completed, would be recognized as one of the most beautiful burial sites ever created in ancient Egypt. Every painting, every hieroglyph, every architectural detail was designed to ensure her safe passage to the afterlife and her eternal happiness in the presence of the gods. For Ramses, no expense was too great to secure the eternal welfare of the woman who had shared his triumphs and supported him through his trials. As the years passed, the pharaoh found himself increasingly drawn to philosophical reflection. The man who had once sought immortality through conquest now pursued it, through contemplation of the eternal truths that governed both mortal life and divine order. His later inscriptions reveal a ruler who had learned to see beyond the immediate concerns of power and politics to the deeper questions that had occupied human minds since civilization began. The peace treaty with the Hittites continued to hold, its success encouraging other kingdoms to seek diplomatic solutions to their disputes. Egypt had become not just a military power, but a moral authority. Its pharaoh recognized throughout the ancient world as a ruler who preferred negotiation to warfare, cooperation to conquest. This reputation would prove to be one of Ramses' most enduring achievements, establishing precedents for international relations that would influence diplomacy for centuries to come. Yet even as he pursued peace, Ramses never forgot the lessons of Kadesh. His armies remained strong, his defenses vigilant, his military commanders well-trained and ready. The pharaoh understood that peace was most secure when backed by strength, that diplomacy was most effective when conducted from a position of respect rather than weakness. The balance he maintained between these seemingly contradictory requirements demonstrated the political genius that had made his reign so successful as the sun set over the Nile on another day of his long reign. Ramses stood on the balcony of his palace, gazing out over the kingdom that had grown and prospered under his rule. The young warrior who had charged into the trap at Kadesh had become the wise king who had built a peace that would outlast his own lifetime. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to serve the gods and the people who had been entrusted to his care. But tonight, he could rest in the knowledge that he had proven worthy of the crown that fate had placed upon his head so many years ago. In the aftermath of Kadesh, as the dust settled over the Syrian plains and the wounded were tended by the light of countless fires, Ramses understood that war alone would not secure his empire's future. The Hittite king Muwatalli had proven himself a worthy adversary, and the great powers of the ancient world had reached a stalemate that could drain both civilizations if left unresolved. The pharaoh's thoughts turned from the immediate glory of battle to the longer vision of lasting peace, trade, and the immortal monuments that would carry his name through eternity. The negotiations that followed Kadesh were conducted with the careful diplomacy of seasoned rulers who recognized mutual strength. Letters traveled back and forth between the courts of Egypt and Hatti, written in the cuneiform script of Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the age. These missives spoke not of conquest, but of borders, of trade routes, and of the marriages that might bind to great powers in alliance rather than enmity. Ramses, ever the pragmatist beneath his divine persona, saw opportunity where others might have seen only the necessity of peace. In the 13th year of his reign, the world's first recorded peace treaty was carved into silver tablets and exchanged between the two empires. The Egyptian version, inscribed on the walls of Karnak Temple, spoke of good peace and good brotherhood between Ramses, beloved of Ra, and Hattusili III, who had succeeded his brother Muwatalli. The treaty established fixed borders, mutual defense pacts, and extradition agreements for political refugees. More importantly for Ramesses, it freed him to turn his boundless energy toward the monuments that would define his legacy. With peace secured on his northern borders, Ramesses embarked upon the most ambitious building program in Egyptian history. He understood, perhaps better than any pharaoh before him, that stone could speak louder than bronze, that temples could conquer hearts more thoroughly than armies could subdue bodies. His architects and engineers became the instruments of a vision that stretched from the cataracts of Nubia to the delta's fertile marshlands. The first and greatest of his monuments rose from the living rock of Abu Simbel, carved into the sandstone cliffs that overlooked the Nile's sweeping curve in distant Nubia. Here, at the empire's southern frontier, Ramses commanded the creation of two temples that would demonstrate Egyptian power to all who sailed past. The larger temple, dedicated to the gods Raharakti, Amen, and Petna, presented for colossal seated figures of the pharaoh himself, each rising 65 feet from the desert floor. The construction of Abu Simbel required the labor of thousands. Over more than 20 years, quarrymen carved deep into the cliff face, following the natural fault lines of the rock. Sculptors worked by torchlight in the growing chambers, their chisels singing against stone as they shaped the pharaoh's features with divine perfection. The temple's orientation was calculated with astronomical precision, so that twice each year, on the anniversary of Ramses' birth and coronation, the rising sun would penetrate the sanctuary to illuminate the seated statues of the gods within. The smaller temple at Abu Simbel was dedicated to the goddess Hathor and to Ramses' beloved queen, Nefertari. 6 standing colossal figures adorned its facade, 4 of the king and 2 of his queen, their forms carved with equal grandeur. This was unprecedented in Egyptian royal art, for never before had a queen been represented on the same scale as her pharaoh husband. The temple walls bore inscriptions declaring Nefertari to be the one for whom the sun shines, a testament to love that transcended the conventions of royal display. While Abu Simbel rose in the south, Ramses was simultaneously transforming the landscape of his homeland. In the eastern delta, where his family had originated, he founded a new capital city that would bear his name, Pi-Ramesses' House of Ramses. This vast urban complex covered 25 square kilometers and housed perhaps 300,000 inhabitants at its height. Its palaces rivaled those of Thebes, its temples glittered with gold and lapis lazuli, and its gardens were watered by canals that connected to the Nile's easternmost branches. Pi-Ramesses was designed as both a royal residence and a military headquarters, positioned strategically to oversee Egypt's Asiatic empire and trade routes. The city's main temple complex honored Ra, the sun god from whom Ramses claimed descent, while smaller shrines celebrated Set, the god particularly beloved in the Delta region. Vast stables housed the royal chariot corps, while armories stored the bronze weapons and leather armor that equipped Egypt's professional army. The construction of Pi-Ramesses revealed Ramses' understanding of soft power alongside military might. Foreign ambassadors who came to negotiate treaties or arrange tribute payments found themselves overwhelmed by the city's splendor. Egyptian artisans had crafted decorative elements that incorporated artistic styles from across the known world, demonstrating the pharaoh's cosmopolitan tastes and the empire's cultural wealth. Gardens bloomed with flowers and trees brought from distant lands, while aviaries housed exotic birds whose songs provided a constant backdrop to diplomatic audiences. At the heart of Ramses' personal world stood his relationships with the women who shared his throne and bore his children. Chief among these was Nefertari, whose name meant beautiful companion, and who had captured the young prince's heart before his ascension to power. Their marriage had been both a love match and a political alliance, uniting Ramses with a noble family whose roots reached deep into Upper Egypt's aristocracy. Nefertari was more than a beautiful ornament to Ramses' court. She was an active participant in royal governance and religious ceremony. Temple reliefs show her performing sacred rituals alongside her husband, offering incense to the gods and participating in festivals that confirmed the divine nature of pharaonic rule. Her correspondence with foreign queens, written in her own hand, reveals a woman of education and diplomatic skill, who helped maintain the personal relationships that underpinned international treaties. The tomb that Ramses prepared for Nefertari in the Valley of the Queens became a masterpiece of ancient art. Its corridors and chambers were decorated with scenes from the Book of the Dead, painted in colors that seemed to glow with inner light. The artists who worked on these walls achieved a refinement of style that had never been equaled, depicting the Queen's journey through the afterlife with such beauty that later visitors would call it the Sistine Chapel of ancient Egypt. Yet Ramses' matrimonial arrangements extended far beyond his love for Nefertari. Royal polygamy served multiple purposes in ancient diplomacy. cementing alliances through marriage ties and demonstrating the pharaoh's divine vitality through his numerous offspring. His second principal wife, Nefertari, came from a military family and bore him several sons who would prove capable commanders in their own right. Other wives included daughters of vassal kings, Hittite princesses sent to seal the peace treaty, and members of Egypt's own nobility. The pharaoh's family grew to enormous proportions during his long reign. Historical records credit him with over 100 children, though the exact number remains disputed by scholars. His sons were trained from childhood in the arts of war and administration, preparing them to serve as governors of distant provinces or commanders of military expeditions. Several would predecease their father, victims of disease or battle, but others would carry on the royal bloodline and the traditions of the 19th dynasty. Among his daughters, several would eventually become wives to their own father, following the ancient practice of pharaonic marriage that kept the royal bloodline pure and concentrated divine power within the family. These marriages, though they seem strange to modern sensibilities, were understood in ancient Egypt as sacred unions that paralleled the relationships among the gods themselves. The goddess Isis had been both sister and wife to Osiris and earthly pharaohs sought to emulate this divine model as Ramses' reign progressed into its third decade. His role as a divine ruler became ever more elaborate and central to Egyptian society. Unlike his predecessors, who had generally been content to be considered gods after death, Ramses proclaimed his divinity during his lifetime and expected to be worshipped as such. Temples throughout Egypt contained statues of the living pharaoh, alongside those of the traditional gods, and priests offered daily prayers and sacrifices for his continued divine favor. This deification was not merely an expression of royal ego, but served important political and social functions. In an empire that stretched from Syria to Sudan, encompassing dozens of different ethnic groups and traditional belief systems, the pharaoh's divine status provided a unifying focus for loyalty and obedience. Local officials could invoke the god-king's authority to settle disputes, collect taxes, and maintain order, while foreign subjects were impressed by Egypt's apparent divine blessing and favor. The royal court at Pi-Ramesses developed elaborate ceremonies that emphasized Ramses' godhood. Daily rituals began before dawn, when priests would enter the pharaoh's private chambers to awaken the divine king with prayers and incense. Every meal became a sacred offering, every public appearance a theophany that allowed ordinary Egyptians to glimpse divinity made manifest. Foreign ambassadors were required to prostrate themselves completely before the golden throne, acknowledging not just political supremacy but religious reverence. Yet beneath the divine trappings, Ramses remained a shrewd and practical ruler who understood the administrative challenges of governing a vast and diverse empire. He established an efficient bureaucracy that could function even when he was absent on military campaigns or inspecting distant provinces. Royal scribes maintained detailed records of tax collections, military conscriptions, and public works projects, creating a paper trail that historians would still be studying thousands of years later. The pharaoh's legendary stamina became part of his divine mythology. Officials marveled at his ability to work from dawn to dusk, reviewing reports from provincial governors, hearing legal appeals, conferring with architects about building projects, and receiving foreign embassies. His physical vigor seemed to match his mental energy. Even in his 70s, he could still mount his chariot and lead ceremonial processions through the streets of his capital cities. Religious festivals during Ramses' reign became spectacular displays of royal wealth and divine favor. The annual Opet festival at Thebes, which celebrated the marriage of Ammon and Mut, now included elaborate processions honoring the living pharaoh as the earthly manifestation of divine power. Golden boats carrying the god's sacred images were accompanied by the pharaoh's own golden chariot, while thousands of priests, musicians, dancers, and soldiers participated in ceremonies that could last for weeks. The peace with the Hittites opened new possibilities for trade and cultural exchange that enriched Egypt beyond anything achieved by previous pharaohs. Merchant caravans now traveled safely along routes that had previously been contested battlegrounds, carrying exotic goods from the distant corners of the known world. Egyptian gold flowed northward to purchase cedar wood from Lebanon, silver from Anatolia, and the beautiful blue lapis lazuli that came from mines in distant Afghanistan. In return, Egypt's agricultural abundance fed much of the eastern Mediterranean world. Ships laden with grain sailed from delta ports to feed the growing cities of Syria and Palestine, while Egyptian textiles, leather goods, and papyrus became essential commodities in international trade. The pharaoh's treasury grew rich on customs duties and trade taxes, providing the wealth that funded his massive building projects and maintained his professional army. The cultural exchange that accompanied this economic prosperity transformed Egyptian art and architecture in subtle but important ways. Foreign artisans working on royal projects introduced new techniques and decorative motifs, while Egyptian craftsmen adapted international styles to their own traditional forms. The result was an artistic renaissance that would influence Mediterranean civilizations for centuries to come. Ramses also understood the importance of cultural diplomacy in maintaining his empire's stability. Egyptian scribes established schools in subject territories, teaching the hieroglyphic script and Egyptian literature to the children of local elites. These educated natives became natural intermediaries between Egyptian administrators and their own peoples, helping to prevent the cultural misunderstandings that could spark rebellion. The pharaoh's court at Pi-Ramesses became a cosmopolitan center where diplomats, merchants, scholars, and artists from across the known world gathered to seek royal favor or conduct business. Foreign princes sent their sons to be educated alongside Egyptian nobles, creating personal relationships that would later prove valuable in maintaining peaceful relations. The royal palace complex included separate quarters for foreign dignitaries, each decorated in architectural styles that would make visiting embassies feel at home. This international character of Ramses' court was reflected in the royal family itself. The pharaoh's Hittite wives brought their own servants, priests, and cultural traditions to Egypt, creating small enclaves of foreign culture within the royal household. Their children, raised bilingual and bicultural, would later serve as natural diplomats in maintaining relations with their mothers' homelands. On the west bank of Thebes, where the desert cliffs caught the last rays of the setting sun, Ramses conceived his most personal monument, the mortuary temple complex known today as the Ramesses. This vast religious and administrative center was designed to serve not only as the pharaoh's memorial, but as an active temple where priests would maintain his cult for eternity. The temple's design incorporated elements from earlier mortuary complexes while introducing innovations that reflected Ramses' unique vision of pharaonic glory. The Ramesses central temple was surrounded by vast storerooms, workshops, and residential quarters for the hundreds of priests, scribes, and craftsmen who would maintain the royal cult. These economic foundations were carefully planned to be self-sustaining, with agricultural estates throughout Egypt dedicated to providing the temple's needs. The pharaoh understood that monuments without endowments would eventually fall into ruin, forgotten by future generations who had no economic incentive to maintain them. The temple's decoration program told the story of Ramses' reign in visual form, with particular emphasis on his military victories and divine relationships. The famous scenes of the Battle of Kadesh covered entire walls, showing the pharaoh charging into enemy ranks while protected by divine favor. Other reliefs depicted religious festivals, royal ceremonies, and the presentation of tribute from subject peoples, creating a comprehensive visual record of the reign's achievements. Perhaps most impressive was the colossal statue of Ramses that dominated the temple's first courtyard. Carved from a single block of granite and standing over 50 feet high, this figure showed the pharaoh seated on his throne with the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt upon his head. The statue's base was inscribed with the royal titles and epithets that proclaimed Ramses' divine nature and imperial accomplishments. Even in ruins, fragments of this colossus would inspire awe in visitors thousands of years later. The Ramesseum also served practical functions as a royal residence during the pharaoh's visits to Thebes. Its palace complex included throne rooms for formal audiences, private apartments for the royal family, and gardens where the pharaoh could relax away from the public eye. Administrative offices housed the bureaucrats who managed Upper Egypt's affairs, while libraries contained the religious texts and historical records that legitimized pharaonic rule. The temple's priests were chosen not only for their religious knowledge but for their administrative skills, since they would manage vast estates and oversee the distribution of food and goods to thousands of dependents. These priestly bureaucrats became powerful figures in their own right, mediating between the divine pharaoh and the common people who depended on the temple's economic activities for their livelihood. As the Ramesseum neared completion in the pharaoh's fourth decade of rule, it stood as a microcosm of Egyptian civilization at its height. The temple complex employed artists, architects, scribes, farmers, herders, fishermen, weavers, metalworkers, and dozens of other specialists, all working together to maintain the elaborate machinery of royal cult and commemoration. Visitors from distant lands would leave with lasting impressions of Egyptian wealth, organization, and divine favor that enhanced the pharaoh's reputation throughout the ancient world. Yet, even as these monuments rose toward the sky, Ramses was beginning to contemplate the ultimate challenge that faced every mortal ruler, even one who claimed divinity. His own body, though still vigorous, showed the first signs of age. His children were growing into adulthood and beginning to think about their own futures. The question of succession, which had seemed distant during the energy of his early reign, now demanded attention from a pharaoh who understood that even gods must eventually yield to the passage of time. The golden age of Ramses the Great had reached its zenith, but the arc of his story was far from complete, and the greatest tests of his wisdom and legacy still lay ahead in the lengthening shadows of his extraordinary reign. The years of endless warfare had carved deep lines into the landscape of the ancient world. Yet from these scars would emerge something unprecedented, peace that would reshape the very foundations of international relations. As Ramses approached his second decade of rule, the great pharaoh found himself standing at a crossroads, where the sword might finally rest and the scroll might speak louder than bronze. In the quiet chambers of Pi-Ramesses, far from the dust and clamor of distant battlefields, scribes bent over papyrus with delicate precision. Their reed pens moved with the careful rhythm of those who understood they were crafting history itself. The document they prepared would become the world's first recorded peace treaty, a testament to the evolution of royal wisdom from the crude calculations of conquest to the subtle art of lasting diplomacy. The Hittite king, Hattusili III, had proven himself a worthy adversary and, more importantly, a pragmatic ruler who recognized the futility of endless conflict. Through intermediaries and careful correspondence, the two great powers had begun to speak the language of mutual benefit rather than mutual destruction. The treaty they negotiated was revolutionary in its scope and sophistication, addressing not merely the cessation of hostilities, but the complex web of relationships that bound the ancient world together. Ramses, now weathered by decades of rule, understood that true greatness lay not in the ability to wage war, but in the wisdom to end it on favorable terms. The treaty established clear boundaries between Egyptian and Hittite spheres of influence, created mechanisms for the extradition of political refugees, and most remarkably, established mutual defense pacts that would see former enemies fighting side by side against common threats. The signing ceremony, conducted with all the pomp befitting such a momentous occasion, marked a turning point not just in Ramses' reign but in the entire conception of international relations. As the great pharaoh affixed his seal to the document, he was not merely ending a war, he was pioneering a new form of statecraft that would influence diplomatic practice for millennia to come. The peace dividend was immediate and substantial. Resources that had been consumed by military campaigns could now be redirected toward the great building projects that would define Ramses' legacy. Trade routes that had been disrupted by conflict could be reopened, bringing prosperity to both kingdoms. Most importantly, the constant threat of Hittite invasion that had shadowed Egypt's northern borders was replaced by the promise of mutual cooperation. Yet peace brought its own challenges. A generation of Egyptian nobles had known only war, their prestige and wealth built upon military success. The transition from a warrior culture to one of diplomacy and trade required careful management of these powerful interests. Ramses demonstrated his political acumen by redirecting their energies toward the monumental construction projects that were transforming Egypt's landscape, ensuring that their desire for glory found new outlets in the creation of lasting monuments. The most symbolic expression of the new peace came in the form of marriage, that ancient diplomatic tool that transformed enemies into family. The arrival of a Hittite princess to join Ramses' already extensive royal household was an event that required the most careful orchestration, for it represented not merely a personal union but the marriage of two great civilizations. The princess, whose name would be Egyptianized as Madonnafer, came to Egypt with a massive dowry and a retinue that filled the roads from the northern borders to Pi-Ramesses. Her journey south was itself a pageant of peace, a visible demonstration that the two kingdoms were now bound by ties of kinship rather than divided by walls of mistrust. Ramses, now in his 40s and bearing the accumulated dignity of long rule, received his new bride with ceremonies that blended Egyptian and Hittite traditions. The wedding was more than a personal celebration. It was a public declaration that the age of conflict had ended and the age of cooperation had begun. The architectural program at Pi-Ramesses was expanded to include monuments commemorating this diplomatic triumph, ensuring that future generations would understand the significance of this peaceful resolution. The Hittite princess found her place within the complex hierarchy of Ramses' household, where her status as a symbol of international peace afforded her considerable influence. Her children would carry in their veins the blood of both kingdoms, living symbols of the new world order that their father had helped to create. The princess herself adapted to Egyptian customs while maintaining connections to her homeland, serving as an informal channel of communication between the two courts. This marriage alliance proved to be remarkably durable, surviving changes in leadership on both sides and serving as a model for future diplomatic marriages. The precedent established by Ramses would influence international relations throughout the ancient world, demonstrating that former enemies could indeed become trusted allies through careful diplomacy and mutual respect. As the third decade of his reign approached, Ramses faced a challenge that few pharaohs had ever confronted: the burden of extraordinary longevity. Most rulers died young, either through violence, disease, or the simple stresses of ancient life. Ramses, however, continued to thrive, his robust constitution carrying him into his 50s and beyond with seemingly inexhaustible energy. This longevity, while blessing Egypt with unprecedented stability, created its own complications. Ramses had outlived many of his original advisors, the men who had helped him navigate the early challenges of his reign. Their replacements, while competent, lacked the intimate knowledge of the pharaoh's character and preferences that had made the earlier administration so effective. The challenge of maintaining governmental continuity across such an extended reign required constant adaptation and renewal. More troubling was the question of succession. Ramses had fathered over 100 children with his various wives and concubines, but the very abundance of potential heirs created its own problems. Several of his older sons had died while still young men, victims of disease or accident. Those who survived found themselves in the awkward position of serving as crown princes for decades, their own lives suspended in anticipation of a throne that seemed perpetually out of reach. The pharaoh's apparent immortality became a source of both stability and stagnation. Government officials, military commanders, and court functionaries all oriented their careers around the assumption that Ramses would rule forever. This created a culture of comfortable routine that, while maintaining order, perhaps lacked the dynamism and innovation that had characterized the earlier years of his reign. Ramses himself seemed to recognize this challenge, making periodic efforts to reinvigorate his administration and prepare for an eventual transition. He began to delegate more authority to his designated heir Marenta, while simultaneously maintaining enough personal control to ensure continuity. The balance between preparing for succession and maintaining effective rule required all of the pharaoh's considerable political skills. The economic implications of such an extended reign were equally complex. On one hand, the stability provided by unchanging leadership facilitated long-term planning and investment. The great building projects could be conceived and executed over decades rather than being subject to the whims of changing rulers. Trade relationships could mature and deepen, providing Egypt with unprecedented prosperity. The peace dividend of Ramses' diplomatic triumphs extended far beyond the mere cessation of military hostilities. With the northern borders secure and trade routes open, Egypt experienced a cultural flowering that rivaled the greatest periods of its long history. Artists, craftsmen, writers, and scholars found themselves working in an environment of unprecedented security and prosperity. Their creative energies, unleashed by the stability that the pharaoh's long reign had provided. The architectural achievements of this period represent perhaps the pinnacle of ancient Egyptian construction. The great temple complexes at Abu Simbel, carved directly into the living rock of the Nile's banks, demonstrated a mastery of engineering and artistic vision that left contemporary observers awestruck. These monuments were not merely expressions of royal ego, but sophisticated theological statements that integrated Egyptian religious tradition with the political realities of the new international order. The Abu Simbel complex, in particular, served multiple functions. The great temple, dedicated to the traditional gods of Egypt, proclaimed the pharaoh's devotion to ancient religious traditions. The smaller temple, honoring his beloved queen Nefertari, demonstrated the elevated status of royal women in the new order. The entire complex, positioned strategically near the southern borders of Egypt, served as a visible reminder to Nubian peoples of Egyptian power and cultural sophistication. The artistic program developed during this period was remarkable for its synthesis of traditional Egyptian motifs with influences from across the known world. The peace with the Hittites had opened new channels of cultural exchange, bringing exotic materials, techniques, and artistic ideas into Egyptian workshops. The result was a distinctive style that maintained the essential character of Egyptian art while incorporating fresh elements that reflected the cosmopolitan nature of Ramses. Kingdom literature and learning also flourished during this period of peace and prosperity. The royal scribal schools produced works of remarkable sophistication, including historical accounts, religious texts, and even what might be considered early forms of diplomatic correspondence. The treaty with the Hittites, preserved in multiple copies and translations, represented a new form of international literature that would influence diplomatic practice for centuries to come. The preservation and copying of ancient texts accelerated during this period, as the stability of Ramses' reign provided the ideal conditions for such scholarly work. Royal scribes undertook systematic efforts to preserve the literary heritage of earlier dynasties, ensuring that the wisdom of the past would not be lost to future generations. These efforts created the foundation for much of what modern scholars know about ancient Egyptian literature and learning. Throughout his long reign, Ramses demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the role of religion in maintaining political stability and social cohesion. His approach to religious matters reflected the same strategic thinking that had made him successful in military and diplomatic affairs. But it also revealed a genuine spiritual dimension that went beyond mere political calculation. The pharaoh's building program was fundamentally religious in character, creating or renovating temples throughout Egypt and its dependencies. These projects served multiple purposes. They provided employment for skilled craftsmen and laborers. They demonstrated royal piety to the gods, and they created focal points for community religious life. The temples also served as economic institutions, managing vast agricultural estates and engaging in trade, activities that contributed to the kingdom's prosperity. Ramses' religious innovations were particularly evident in his treatment of foreign deities and religious practices. Rather than simply suppressing the religious traditions of conquered peoples, he often incorporated them into the broader framework of Egyptian religious life. This inclusive approach helped to integrate diverse populations into the Egyptian state while maintaining the essential character of Egyptian religious tradition. The pharaoh's own relationship with the divine was complex and multifaceted. While maintaining the traditional Egyptian conception of divine kingship, he also presented himself as a personal devotee of particular deities, especially Ra, the sun god whose name he bore. This personal dimension of his religious life was reflected in the intimate character of some of his temple inscriptions, which reveal a man genuinely concerned with his spiritual obligations and relationship with the divine. The religious festivals and ceremonies of Ramses' reign were notable for their scale and sophistication. The great festivals, such as the Opet festival at Thebes, became elaborate pageants that combined religious devotion with political theater. These events served to reinforce the bonds between ruler and ruled, while providing the population with opportunities for collective celebration and spiritual renewal. Perhaps most significantly, Ramses' religious policies helped to create a sense of Egyptian identity that transcended regional and ethnic divisions. By maintaining and strengthening the traditional religious institutions, while adapting them to contemporary needs, he created a framework for cultural unity that would survive even the eventual decline of pharaonic power. The prosperity that marked the later years of Ramses' reign was not accidental, but reflected a sophisticated understanding of economic policy that was far ahead of its time. The pharaoh and his advisors implemented a series of reforms and innovations that transformed Egypt into the wealthiest and most economically advanced kingdom of the ancient world. The foundation of this economic success was agricultural reform. Ramses invested heavily in irrigation infrastructure, expanding the canal systems that brought Nile water to previously arid lands. These projects required enormous initial investments, but generated long-term returns that far exceeded their costs. The increased agricultural productivity not only fed Egypt's growing population, but also created surpluses that could be traded for luxury goods and raw materials from across the known world. The pharaoh's trade policies were equally innovative. Rather than simply extracting tribute from conquered territories, he established a network of commercial relationships that benefited all parties involved. The peace with the Hittites opened new trade routes that brought exotic goods from Asia Minor and beyond, while the security of Egypt's borders encouraged merchants from distant lands to establish permanent trading posts in Egyptian cities. The royal workshops and manufacturing centers that developed during this period represented a significant advance in industrial organization. Skilled craftsmen working under royal patronage created goods of unprecedented quality and sophistication, from jewelry and luxury textiles to weapons and architectural components. These workshops served as training centers where new techniques were developed and transmitted to the next generation of artisans. The monetary system that evolved during Ramses' reign, while still based primarily on barter and payment in kind, incorporated sophisticated methods of valuation and exchange that facilitated complex commercial transactions. The standardization of weights and measures enforced throughout the kingdom reduced transaction costs and encouraged trade. Royal granaries served as both storage facilities and crude banks, providing credit to farmers and merchants while maintaining strategic reserves for times of shortage. The tax system was reformed to be both more efficient and more equitable, with assessments based on actual productivity rather than arbitrary levies. This encouraged agricultural and commercial development, while ensuring that the royal treasury had adequate resources for the great building projects and military forces that were the foundation of Egyptian power. The success of the peace treaty with the Hittites encouraged Ramses to extend his diplomatic efforts to other kingdoms throughout the ancient world. What emerged was a sophisticated network of relationships that established Egypt as the preeminent diplomatic power of the age, with influence extending from Nubia in the south to Mesopotamia in the east. The Nubian kingdoms, which had long been subject to Egyptian influence, were incorporated more fully into the Egyptian sphere through a combination of diplomatic marriage, economic incentives, and selective military pressure. Rather than ruling through conquest alone, Ramses established relationships with local rulers that gave them considerable autonomy in exchange for loyalty and tribute. This approach proved more durable and less costly than direct military occupation relations, with the kingdoms of the Levant required more delicate handling, as these regions were contested between Egyptian and various Mesopotamian powers. Ramses' diplomatic strategy involved creating a network of client states that served as buffers against potential threats while providing Egypt with forward bases for projecting power when necessary. The key to success in this complex environment was maintaining the flexibility to shift alliances as circumstances changed while never abandoning core Egyptian interests. The pharaoh's correspondence with foreign rulers, preserved in the royal archives, reveals a sophisticated understanding of international relations that anticipated many principles of modern diplomacy. Letters discussing trade agreements, territorial disputes, and dynastic marriages demonstrate a level of diplomatic skill that was remarkable for its time. The tone of these communications suggests that Ramses was regarded by his contemporaries as a peer rather than merely another regional potentate. Perhaps most innovative was Ramses' use of cultural exchange as a diplomatic tool. Scholars, artists, and craftsmen moved freely between Egypt and allied kingdoms, carrying with them not only their skills, but also Egyptian values and perspectives. This cultural diplomacy created bonds of understanding and mutual respect that proved more durable than military alliances based purely on expedience. The diplomatic marriage policy, pioneered with the Hittite princess, was extended to other kingdoms as well. Ramses' numerous wives represented not just personal relationships, but a complex web of international alliances that bound Egypt to kingdoms throughout the ancient world. Each marriage was carefully negotiated to advance Egyptian interests while respecting the customs and dignity of the bride's homeland. This diplomatic network required constant maintenance and attention. The pharaoh's foreign ministry, staffed by skilled linguists and cultural specialists, maintained regular correspondence with allied courts and monitored developments that might affect Egyptian interests. Intelligence gathering became increasingly sophisticated, with networks of informants and diplomatic observers providing regular reports on political developments throughout the known world. As the fourth decade of his reign approached, Ramses could look back on diplomatic achievements that had fundamentally transformed the ancient world. The warrior pharaoh of his youth had evolved into a master of international relations, whose influence extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of Egyptian power. Yet with this success came new challenges, as the very longevity that had made these achievements possible began to create problems of its own. The question of succession, temporarily overshadowed by the triumphs of peace and prosperity, began to reassert itself with increasing urgency as the great pharaoh entered the final phase of his extraordinary reign. The diplomatic revolution that Ramses had engineered would outlast his reign, creating precedents and expectations that would influence international relations for centuries to come. The peace treaty with the Hittites would be studied and emulated by future generations of diplomats, while the network of alliances and relationships he had constructed would provide a foundation for Egypt's continued influence, even as the kingdom faced new challenges in the centuries ahead. But in the quiet moments between the great ceremonies and diplomatic receptions, Ramses perhaps reflected on the personal costs of his public triumphs. The burden of rule, carried for so many decades, had transformed him from the vigorous young warrior who had charged through the ranks at Kadesh into a weathered statesman whose every decision carried the weight of history. The crown that had once seemed so bright and full of promise now felt heavy with the accumulated responsibilities of a lifetime of power. The great pharaoh's thoughts increasingly turned to legacy, to the monuments and institutions that would survive long after the man who created them had joined his ancestors in the afterlife. The temples rising along the Nile, the treaties signed with foreign powers, the peace that had brought prosperity to millions of his subjects. These would be his true monuments, more lasting than bronze or stone. Yet the question that haunted him, as it haunts all mortal rulers, was whether the foundations he had laid would prove strong enough to support the weight of the future. The final seasons of the pharaoh's reign arrived like autumn touching the palm fronds of the Nile, subtle at first, then undeniable in their gentle persistence. Ramses, too, now bearing the weight of more than 8 decades upon his shoulders, continued to hold the crook and flail with hands that had once been steady as temple pillars, though time had begun to carve its own hieroglyphs upon his weathered palms. The great pharaoh's body, which had once moved with the fluid grace of a hunting leopard across battlefield and throne room alike, now required the gentle assistance of faithful servants as he made his way through the corridors of Pi-Ramesses. His step, though slower, carried the same dignity that had once struck wonder into the hearts of foreign ambassadors and trembled into the souls of Egypt's enemies. The eyes that had gazed across the smoking ruins of Kadesh and watched the sun rise over the completed facade of Abu Simbel now held the depth of accumulated wisdom, like pools that had gathered the reflections of countless seasons. In these twilight years, Ramses too became a living archive of Egypt's glory. Younger courtiers would gather in respectful silence as he spoke of battles fought in distant lands, of negotiations conducted under starlit desert skies, of the feeling of limestone dust beneath his fingernails as he personally inspected the carving of his monuments. His voice, though gentler now than the commanding tone that had once echoed through the great hypostyle hall at Karnak, still carried the authority of one who had spoken with gods and shaped the destiny of nations. The management of the kingdom had gradually shifted to his capable sons, particularly Prince Nefertari, who had proven himself worthy of the double crown through decades of faithful service and demonstrated wisdom. Yet even as administrative duties passed to younger hands, the pharaoh's presence remained the spiritual cornerstone of Egypt. Priests still sought his blessing for major ceremonies. Generals still requested his counsel on matters of defense. And the common people still looked toward the palace, knowing that their god-king watched over them with the protective gaze of a divine father. The temples throughout Egypt continued their daily rituals in honor of their living pharaoh. But there was a poignancy to these ceremonies, now a recognition that the eternal had taken mortal form for a remarkable span of time, and that this blessed incarnation could not continue forever. The priests offered their prayers with particular fervor, as if their devotion might convince the gods to grant their beloved ruler even more years upon the throne of the two lands. During these final years, Ramses II often found himself drawn to the gardens of his palace, where he would sit in the shade of palm trees that had been saplings when he first assumed the crown. The lotus pools reflected his aged but still noble features, and the sound of water flowing through carefully constructed channels reminded him of the eternal Nile that had witnessed the rise and fall of so many pharaohs before him. Here, in moments of quiet contemplation, he would sometimes speak softly to his beloved Nefertari, as if her spirit lingered still in the evening breezes that stirred the papyrus reeds. The pharaoh's appetite for life remained strong even as his physical strength gradually waned. He continued to take interest in the construction projects that bore his name, though he now viewed them from the comfort of a portable throne rather than climbing the scaffolding as he had in his more vigorous years. Artisans would bring him samples of gold leaf and precious stones, seeking his approval for decorative elements that would ensure his monuments would shine with divine radiance for generations yet unborn. As the seasons turned, bringing the familiar cycle of flood, planting, and harvest that had marked the rhythm of Egyptian civilization since time immemorial, Ramses too found profound satisfaction in knowing that he had maintained and strengthened this eternal order. The mat that he had sworn to uphold as a young pharaoh remained intact throughout his domains. The borders were secure, the temples were magnificent, the people were fed, and Egypt's influence extended to the farthest reaches of the known world. The winter of 1213 BCE arrived with unusual gentleness along the Nile, as if nature itself sought to ease the passage of one who had lived so long in harmony with the cosmic order. In the month that would later be called February by distant civilizations not yet born, the great pharaoh felt the first unmistakable whispers of his approaching transformation. It came not as an enemy to be fought, but as a familiar presence, the same force that had claimed his beloved father Seti, his cherished Nefertari, and all the mortals who had walked beside him through the decades of his extraordinary reign, Ramses. To face this final transition with the same courage and wisdom that had characterized his entire life, he called his sons and daughters to his bedside, offering each of them words of guidance and blessing. To Meneptah, his chosen successor, he spoke of the sacred responsibility of kingship, reminding him that a pharaoh's true power lay not in the fear he could inspire, but in the love and prosperity he could bring to his people. To his other children, he offered counsel tailored to their individual strengths and destinies, ensuring that his legacy would be carried forward through their actions and character. The royal physicians, masters of medical arts that would not be equaled in many lands for centuries to come, attended their pharaoh with every skill at their disposal. They prepared healing potions from rare herbs gathered from the farthest reaches of Nubia and Syria. But they understood, as did their patient, that some journeys cannot be postponed indefinitely. The God-King's mortal form, which had served as the earthly vessel for divine power for 66 remarkable years, was preparing to release that power back to the eternal realm from which it had come. Throughout Pi-Ramesses and across the length and breadth of Egypt, the people sensed that their great pharaoh's time of transformation was approaching. They gathered in temples to offer prayers and incense, not begging for a miracle, but rather expressing their gratitude for the blessed years they had been granted under his protection. The very air seemed to shimmer with anticipation and reverence, as if the boundary between the earthly and divine realms was growing thin in preparation for the passage of one who had walked so successfully between both worlds in his final conscious moments. Ramses too spoke quietly with the high priests who had served him faithfully throughout his reign. His voice, though weakened by age, still carried the unmistakable authority of one who had communed with gods and shaped the destiny of empires. He gave final instructions for the continuation of temple rituals, the maintenance of his monuments, and the proper conduct of his burial ceremonies. Every detail was considered with the same meticulous attention he had always brought to matters of state and divine protocol. As the sun set over the western desert on what would be his final day as living pharaoh, Ramses II turned his gaze toward the horizon where Ra began his nightly journey through the underworld. The golden light that had blessed so many of his triumphs now seemed to reach through the palace windows, specifically to touch his weathered features with a gentle radiance. In that moment, surrounded by his beloved family and faithful servants, the great pharaoh closed his eyes and released his divine spirit to join the eternal company of gods and ancestors who had been waiting to welcome him home. The moment of his passing was marked not by dramatic signs or supernatural portents, but by a profound sense of peace that seemed to settle over all of Egypt like a blessing. The birds continued their evening songs, the Nile continued its eternal flow, and the stars emerged in their timeless patterns, all bearing witness to the completion of one of the most remarkable reigns in human history. Ramses the Great had become Ramses the Eternal, transformed from earthly ruler to divine ancestor in the endless cycle that had governed Egyptian beliefs since the dawn of their civilization. The death of Ramses II initiated the most elaborate and sacred burial preparations ever undertaken in the land of Egypt. The master embalmers, inheritors of techniques refined over millennia and perfected during the New Kingdom's golden age, approached their most sacred duty with reverence befitting their divine subject. These skilled artisans understood that they were not merely preserving a corpse, but preparing the earthly vessel of a god-king for his eternal journey through the afterlife and his eventual resurrection in the company of Ra. The process began immediately after the pharaoh's death, when his body was carefully transported to the sacred workshops located on the west bank of the Nile, where the sun god began his nightly journey through the underworld. Here, in chambers filled with the aromatic smoke of frankincense and myrrh, the embalmers began their seventh-day ritual of transformation. The chief embalmer, wearing the jackal mask of Anubis, made the first ceremonial incision while reciting prayers that had been spoken over pharaohs for over 1,000 years. Every step of the mummification process was conducted with meticulous attention to both practical preservation and religious significance. The internal organs were carefully removed and placed in canopic jars, watched over by the 4 sons of Horus, each protected deity responsible for safeguarding a different aspect of the pharaoh's physical being for his eventual resurrection. The brain was extracted through the nasal cavity using long bronze instruments, while prayers were offered to Thoth, god of wisdom, asking him to preserve the pharaoh's divine intelligence for eternity. The body was then immersed in natron salt, imported from the sacred deposits found in the desert, where it remained for 40 days while the natural salts drew out all moisture and prevented decay. During this time, priests maintained constant vigils, burning incense and reciting from the sacred texts that would guide the pharaoh's soul through the perils of the underworld. The pyramid texts, the coffin texts, and the Book of the Dead were all invoked to ensure that Ramses II would successfully navigate the trials that awaited him on his journey to eternal life. When the dehydration process was complete, the embalmers began the intricate work of wrapping the pharaoh's body in hundreds of yards of the finest linen. Between the layers of cloth, they placed amulets of gold, silver, and precious stones, each one carefully positioned according to ancient formulas, designed to protect different parts of the body and grant the deceased specific powers in the afterlife. The golden scarab placed over the heart would ensure that Ramses II's heart would speak truthfully when weighed against the feather of Mat in the final judgment. The pharaoh's face was covered with a magnificent golden mask, crafted by the finest goldsmiths in Egypt and inlaid with lapis lazuli from distant Afghanistan and turquoise from the mines of Sinai. This mask was not merely decorative, but served as a magical protection, ensuring that the gods would recognize Ramses II's divine nature when he appeared before them in the afterlife. The artisans who created this masterpiece worked from life portraits painted during the pharaoh's reign, capturing not just his physical appearance, but the noble bearing that had commanded respect from enemies and allies alike. Throughout the 70 days of preparation, all of Egypt remained in a state of official mourning. The temples echoed with funeral hymns. Courtiers wore simple white linen instead of their usual colorful garments, and no festivals or celebrations were permitted, while their divine ruler underwent his sacred transformation. The people understood that they were witnessing not just the end of a reign, but the completion of one phase of their pharaoh's eternal existence and the beginning of his role as a protective ancestor, watching over Egypt from the realm of the gods. As the final day of preparation arrived, the completed mummy was placed within a series of nested coffins, each more magnificent than the last. The innermost coffin was crafted from solid gold and decorated with intricate hieroglyphic inscriptions proclaiming Ramses II's divine titles and accomplishments. The middle coffin, made of gilded wood, bore scenes from the pharaoh's journey through the underworld, while the outermost sarcophagus, carved from red granite quarried in distant Aswan, was inscribed with protective spells and royal cartouches that would identify the pharaoh to the gods for all eternity. The funeral procession that carried Ramses II to his eternal resting place was the most magnificent spectacle Egypt had ever witnessed. Beginning before dawn from the palace at Pi-Ramesses, the cortege stretched for miles along the royal road leading to Thebes and the Valley of the Kings. At its head walked the priests of Ammon, their shaved heads gleaming in the early morning light as they carried incense burners that filled the air with sacred smoke. Behind them came the professional mourners, their ritual wails rising and falling in ancient melodies of grief and celebration. The pharaoh's golden sarcophagus traveled upon a magnificent funeral barge, painted with scenes of the sun god's journey through the underworld and decorated with thousands of flowers gathered from temple gardens throughout Egypt. The barge was pulled by oxen whose horns had been gilded for the occasion, while priestesses scattered lotus petals in the path of their beloved ruler's final earthly journey. Musicians played harps and flutes, their melodies weaving through the morning air like prayers made audible. All along the route, the people of Egypt had gathered to bid farewell to their great pharaoh. Farmers left their fields, craftsmen abandoned their workshops, and merchants closed their stalls to stand in respectful silence as the procession passed. Many threw flowers or small offerings into the path of the funeral barge, while others raised their children high so that they might one day tell their own grandchildren that they had witnessed the funeral of Ramses the Great. The overwhelming sentiment was not just of loss, but of profound gratitude for the 66 years of prosperity and protection their pharaoh had provided. When the procession reached Thebes, the ancient city erupted in a display of ceremonial pageantry that had been planned for months. The great temples of Karnak and Luxor opened their doors, and the statues of the gods were carried forth to pay their respects to their deceased earthly representative. The high priest of Ammon performed rituals that hadn't been used since the funeral of Tutankhamun, while the priestesses of Hathor sang hymns that called upon the goddess of love and joy to welcome the pharaoh into the eternal realm where sorrow has no meaning. The final stage of the journey took the procession across the Nile to the West Bank, where the Valley of the Kings waited to receive its most illustrious resident. Here, in the shadow of the pyramid-shaped mountain peak that the ancient Egyptians called the Goddess of the West, lay tomb KV7, the magnificent burial chamber that had been under construction for most of Ramses II's reign. The tomb, cut deep into the limestone bedrock, consisted of multiple chambers and corridors decorated with the most exquisite religious art Egypt's master craftsmen could create. The walls of the tomb were covered with scenes from the Amduat, the sacred text that described the sun god's nightly journey through the 12 hours of the underworld. Every image had been painted with meticulous care, using pigments that would retain their vibrant colors for millennia. The ceiling of the burial chamber was decorated with a magnificent astronomical map, showing the constellations and celestial bodies that would guide the pharaoh's soul through the heavens. Golden stars set against a deep blue background created the impression that the tomb itself was a gateway to the cosmic realm where the pharaoh would take his place among the eternal gods. The burial ceremony itself was conducted according to rituals that traced their origins back to the very dawn of Egyptian civilization. The high priest performed the opening of the mouth ceremony, using sacred tools to restore the pharaoh's ability to speak, eat, and breathe in the afterlife. Sacred oils were applied to the mummy, while prayers were recited to ensure that Ramses II would maintain his physical form and divine powers throughout eternity. The ceremony concluded with the sealing of the tomb, after which the pharaoh's earthly remains would rest undisturbed, waiting for the day of resurrection when he would join Ra in ruling over a transformed world. As the last of the mourners departed, from the Valley of the Kings and the sun set over the western horizon, a profound silence settled over the royal necropolis. Deep beneath the desert floor, surrounded by treasures worthy of a god and protected by spells inscribed by master scribes, Ramses the Great began his journey through the afterlife. The ancient Egyptians believed that death was not an ending, but a transformation, and that their greatest pharaoh would continue to watch over Egypt from his place in the divine realm, ready to return and reclaim his throne when the cosmic cycle reached its destined completion. In the centuries that followed the burial of Ramses II, his tomb in the Valley of the Kings became a place of pilgrimage and wonder for those who remembered the glory of his reign. Even as Egypt's political power waned and foreign rulers claimed the throne of the pharaohs, the memory of Ramses the Great continued to inspire awe and reverence. His monuments, scattered across the length of the Nile from Nubia to the Delta, stood as eternal testimonies to an age when Egypt had been the undisputed master of the ancient world. The great temple of Abu Simbel continued to fulfill its original purpose, marking Egypt's southern border with magnificent authority. Even as the political boundaries of the kingdom shifted with the changing tides of history, twice each year, on the pharaoh's birthday and coronation day, the rising sun would penetrate the temple's inner sanctuary and illuminate the seated statues of Ramses II, flanked by the gods Amun-Ra and Ra-Harakti. This miraculous alignment, achieved through the mathematical precision of ancient Egyptian architects, served as an annual reminder that the spirit of the great pharaoh remained active and watchful, continuing to receive the blessings of the sun god even in death. The capital, city of Pi-Ramesses, despite its grandeur, gradually declined as later dynasties established their power centers elsewhere. The great palaces and temples that had been the pharaohs' pride slowly crumbled under the relentless assault of time and weather, their stones quarried for new construction projects by practical rulers who respected the past, but needed to focus on the challenges of their own eras. Yet even as the physical city faded, the memory of its golden age persisted in the stories told by scribes and priests, who preserved accounts of the magnificent court life and international diplomacy that had once flourished there. Greek and Roman travelers who visited Egypt in later periods marveled at the monuments of Ramses II, recording their impressions in texts that would carry the pharaoh's fame far beyond the borders of his original kingdom. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote extensively about the wonders he had witnessed along the Nile, while Roman writers compared their own emperors to the legendary pharaoh, whose achievements seemed to dwarf those of mortal rulers. These classical authors, writing centuries after Ramses II's death, helped ensure that his reputation would survive even the eventual collapse of Egyptian civilization itself. The Christian era brought profound changes to Egypt as ancient temples were converted. Two churches and the old gods were gradually replaced by new forms of worship. Yet even the early Christian monks who inhabited the desert monasteries spoke with respect of the great pharaoh who had ruled with wisdom and justice, recognizing in his reign certain virtues that transcended religious differences. The Coptic Christians of Egypt maintained traditions that could be traced back to pharaonic times, preserving elements of the ancient culture even as they embraced their new faith. When Arab armies conquered Egypt in the 7th century CE, bringing Islam to the land of the pharaohs, they too were impressed by the monumental legacy of Ramses II. Medieval Arabic historians wrote admiringly of the ancient kings, who had built wonders that surpassed anything in their own time, while Islamic scholars studied the astronomical alignments of pharaonic temples with the same reverence they brought to their own religious observations. The tomb of Ramses II, though hidden and largely forgotten by this time, continued its silent vigil beneath the desert floor, waiting for the day when modern archaeology would rediscover its treasures. During the Ottoman period, European travelers began arriving in Egypt in increasing numbers, drawn by reports of ancient wonders and mysterious hieroglyphic inscriptions that no living person could read. These early explorers, armed with sketchbooks and measuring tools rather than archaeological training, documented the visible remains of Ramses II's monuments with a mixture of scientific curiosity and romantic fascination. Their published accounts, illustrated with detailed engravings, introduced the pharaoh's legacy to a wider world that was just beginning to appreciate the sophistication of ancient Egyptian civilization. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799, and its subsequent decipherment by Jean-François Champollion in 1822, revolutionized the study of ancient Egypt, finally providing scholars with the key to reading hieroglyphic inscriptions. Suddenly, the monuments of Ramses II could speak again, telling their stories in the pharaoh's own words after millennia of silence. The royal cartouches that appeared on temples throughout Egypt were identified, and the full extent of Ramses II's building program became apparent to amazed archaeologists, who realized they were studying the remains of one of history's most prolific builders. The most dramatic chapter in the posthumous story of Ramses II began in 1881, when a chance discovery by local villagers led to the greatest archaeological find in Egyptian history. Hidden in a remote cliffside tomb at Deir el-Bahari, archaeologists discovered a cache of royal mummies that had been secretly moved there by ancient priests to protect them from tomb robbers. Among these preserved pharaohs lay Ramses the Great himself, his mummy wrapped in linen bearing inscriptions that identified him beyond any doubt as the ruler who had dominated the ancient world for 66 remarkable years. The moment when Gaston Maspero, the French Egyptologist who supervised the unwrapping of the mummy, first gazed upon the actual face of Ramses, marked a profound connection across more than 3 millennia of history. Here was the pharaoh who had negotiated with Hittite kings, built Abu Simbel, and ruled an empire that stretched from Nubia to Syria, now lying peacefully in death, but still recognizably the same man whose features had been immortalized in countless statues and reliefs. The preservation was so remarkable that even the pharaoh's hair, reddened with henna in the ancient Egyptian fashion, remained intact and perfectly visible. Scientific examination of the mummy revealed fascinating details about the pharaoh's final years. Medical experts determined that Ramses II had lived to the extraordinary age of 90 or more, an achievement remarkable for any era, but especially impressive in ancient times, when life expectancy was far shorter than modern standards. Evidence of arthritis in his joints spoke of the physical toll taken by his long and active life, while dental problems suggested the typical dietary challenges faced by ancient peoples. Yet overall, the mummy demonstrated that the pharaoh had enjoyed robust health throughout most of his extended reign. The discovery of Ramses II's mummy created a sensation throughout the archaeological world and captured the imagination of the general public as few ancient finds had ever done. Newspapers around the globe carried headlines about the pharaoh's resurrection, while museums competed for the opportunity to display this most famous of ancient rulers. The mummy was transported to Cairo's Egyptian Museum, where it became the centerpiece of one of the world's greatest collections of pharaonic artifacts, drawing millions of visitors who came to gaze upon the actual mortal remains of a man who had been worshipped as a god in 1976. The mummy of Ramses II made another remarkable journey when it was flown to Paris for conservation treatment that could not be performed in Egypt. The pharaoh, traveling with a diplomatic passport identifying him as king deceased, received full state honors from the French government, a recognition of his continued status as one of history's most significant rulers. French scientists used the most advanced techniques available to stabilize the mummy and treat fungal infections that threatened its preservation, ensuring that future generations would be able to study this invaluable link to the ancient world. Modern archaeological techniques have continued to reveal new aspects of Ramses II's reign and personality. Ground-penetrating radar and satellite imaging have located previously unknown sites associated with his building programs, while computer analysis of inscriptions has provided fresh insights into his administrative methods and diplomatic correspondence. DNA analysis of his mummy has confirmed his familial relationships with other royal mummies, allowing researchers to construct detailed family trees that illuminate the complex dynamics of New Kingdom royal succession. The digital age has brought Ramses II's legacy to a global audience in ways that would have amazed the ancient pharaoh who first conceived the idea of building monuments to ensure his eternal remembrance. Virtual reality reconstructions allow visitors to walk through his temples as they appeared in their original glory, complete with painted walls and gleaming gold decorations. Higher resolution photography has captured every detail of his monuments, making it possible for scholars around the world to study inscriptions and reliefs that were previously accessible only to those who could travel to Egypt. Perhaps most remarkably, the face of Ramses II has been reconstructed using sophisticated computer modeling based on detailed scans of his skull. These reconstructions reveal a man of strong features and noble bearing, matching the idealized portraits carved by ancient artists, but adding the subtle imperfections and character lines that marked him as unmistakably human despite his divine status. Looking into these reconstructed features, modern viewers can glimpse something of the personality that commanded armies, negotiated treaties, and inspired the construction of monuments that still inspire wonder after more than 3,000 years. As the 21st century progresses, the legacy of Ramses II continues to evolve and expand, reaching new audiences through technologies and media that the ancient pharaoh could never have imagined. His story has been told and retold in countless books, documentaries, and films, each generation finding new relevance in his achievements and struggles. For some, he represents the pinnacle of ancient leadership and state building. For others, he embodies the human desire to create lasting monuments that will preserve one's memory against the erosion of time. Archaeological work in Egypt continues to reveal new aspects of Ramses II's reign, with excavations regularly uncovering artifacts and inscriptions that add fresh details to our understanding of his era. Recent discoveries have included workshops where artisans created the decorative elements for his monuments, residential areas where the workers and officials of his administration lived, and even fragments of papyrus documents that provide glimpses into the daily business of running an ancient empire. Each new find adds another piece to the complex puzzle of understanding how one man managed to leave such an indelible mark on human civilization. The monuments of Ramses to face ongoing challenges from environmental factors, tourism pressure, and the inevitable effects of time. But international conservation efforts work constantly to preserve these irreplaceable links to our shared human heritage. The temples of Abu Simbel, relocated in one of the most ambitious archaeological projects ever undertaken, continue to attract visitors from around the world who come to witness the pharaoh's architectural vision made manifest in stone. The careful balance between preservation and public access ensures that future generations will be able to experience the same sense of awe that has inspired visitors for millennia. Educational institutions worldwide include the story of Ramses II in their curricula, recognizing his reign as a crucial period for understanding ancient history, international relations, and cultural development. Students learning about ancient Egypt invariably encounter his name alongside those of Tutankhamun and Cleopatra, though his actual historical significance far exceeds that of either of his more famous successors. Through these educational programs, new generations discover the remarkable story of a man who transformed himself from crown prince to living god, leaving behind a legacy that continues to inspire and inform thousands of years after his death. The diplomatic correspondence discovered in the archives of ancient Near Eastern kingdoms continues to provide insights into Ramses' skills as a statesman and negotiator. His peace treaty with the Hittites, preserved in both Egyptian and Hittite versions, is still studied by modern diplomats and international relations experts as an early example of successful conflict resolution and treaty negotiation. The pharaohs. The ability to transform military enemies into peaceful allies offers lessons that remain relevant in our contemporary world of international politics and diplomacy. Artists and architects continue to draw inspiration from the monuments of Ramses. 2. Finding in their grand scale and harmonious proportions principles of design that transcend cultural and temporal boundaries. The integration of sculpture, architecture, and landscape architecture that characterizes his greatest monuments demonstrates an aesthetic vision that modern designers still study and emulate. The pharaoh's understanding of how to create spaces that inspire awe and reverence while maintaining human scale and accessibility offers valuable lessons for contemporary creators of public spaces and monuments. In the realm of popular culture, Ramses too has become an archetypal figure representing the power and mystery of ancient Egypt. His name appears in novels, films, and television productions that seek to capture the imagination of modern audiences with stories of ancient glory and adventure. While these popular representations often take liberties with historical accuracy, they serve the important function of maintaining public interest in ancient history and inspiring some viewers to seek out more scholarly sources to learn about the real pharaoh behind the fictional portrayals. The mummy of Ramses II, now housed in the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization in Cairo, continues to serve as a powerful connection between the ancient and modern worlds. Visitors who stand before his sarcophagus often report a profound sense of encountering history in its most tangible form. Here lies an actual person who knew and spoke with individuals whose names appear in the Bible, who made decisions that affected the course of ancient history, and who witnessed events that shaped the development of human civilization. This direct physical link to the ancient world provides a type of historical understanding that no amount of reading or scholarly analysis can fully replicate in the deepest hours of night, when the desert holds its breath and the ancient stones release the heat they have gathered from Ra's daily passage across the sky. There are those who say that the spirit of Ramses the Great still walks among his monuments, not as a ghost or spectre, but as a presence woven into the very fabric of the land he loved and shaped with such devotion. The wind that moves through the columns of Abu Simbel carries whispers of royal proclamations issued in a voice that once commanded the loyalty of millions. The sand that shifts around the bases of his obelisks holds the memory of processions that celebrated victories won on distant battlefields under foreign stars. The Nile, eternal in its flowing, continues to carry the reflections of monuments built to honor the pharaoh's divine status, their surfaces gleaming in moonlight, just as they did on the night when the great king closed his eyes for the last time in mortal sleep. The river remembers the barges that once carried tribute from Nubian provinces, the diplomatic vessels that brought Hittite princesses to join the royal household, and the funeral barge that bore the pharaoh's mummy to its resting place in the Valley of the Kings. Time flows like water, but memory, carved in stone and inscribed in the landscape itself, endures beyond the reach of temporal erosion. In distant lands, where Ramses II's armies once marched and his diplomats once negotiated, traces of his influence can still be found by those who know how to look. Archaeological fragments surface in Syrian soil, bearing the cartouche of the pharaoh who brought Egyptian power to its furthest extent. Hittite archives yield tablets that mention his name with respect, acknowledging him as a worthy adversary who became an honorable ally. The very geography of international relations in the ancient Near East was shaped by decisions he made in the councils of Pi-Ramesses, and those patterns of interaction influenced the development of diplomacy and statecraft for centuries to come. Artisans who carved his monuments signed their work with invisible hands, leaving behind techniques and aesthetic principles that influenced Egyptian art for the remainder of pharaonic history. The mathematical precision of his architects established standards of proportion and alignment that continued to guide temple builders throughout the Ptolemaic period and beyond. Even the Greek and Roman conquerors who eventually claimed Egypt as their own recognized the superiority of pharaonic building methods and incorporated elements of Ramses II's architectural legacy into their own construction projects. The stories told about Ramses the Great have themselves become part of human heritage, passed down through generations of storytellers who understood that some lives transcend the boundaries of individual biography to become collective memory. His tale has been recounted around campfires in the Western Desert, in the halls of medieval Islamic scholars, in the salons of European Enlightenment thinkers, and in modern university lecture halls where new generations of students encounter ancient history. Each telling adds another layer to the palimpsest of his legacy, ensuring that his influence continues to expand rather than diminish with the passage of time. The pharaoh who once declared himself beloved of Ra and chosen of the gods achieved a form of immortality that even he, in his most ambitious dreams, might not have fully envisioned. He sought to be remembered through monuments of stone and inscriptions of gold, but his true monument has proven to be the inspiration he provides to those who study leadership, creativity, and the human capacity for achievement. His legacy lives not only in the museums that house his artifacts and the archaeological sites that preserve his buildings, but in the minds and hearts of all who draw strength from his example of what determined individuals can accomplish when they align their personal ambitions with purposes larger than themselves. In the end, Ramses II achieved something that eluded most of the rulers who came before or after him. He created a story that became inseparable from the land itself, Egypt cannot be understood without reference to his reign, nor can the ancient world be comprehended without acknowledging his role in shaping the political and cultural landscape of his era. He transformed himself from mortal prince to legendary king, from temporal ruler to eternal symbol, from historical figure to archetypal representation of royal power exercised with wisdom and devoted to the welfare of those who looked to him for protection and guidance. As dawn breaks over the monuments that bear his name, as the sun rises once again over Abu Simbel and the ruins of Pi-Ramesses, as light touches the hieroglyphs that spell out his titles and accomplishments, the story of Ramses the Great continues. It lives in the stones he caused to be carved, in the spaces he designed for worship and wonder, in the treaties he negotiated and the peace he secured, in the love he shared with Nefertari and the legacy he passed to his children, in the prosperity he brought to Egypt and the respect he earned from his enemies. His name, written in stars above the Valley of the Kings, whispers still through the desert wind, carried on the breath of eternity toward horizons where new stories wait to be born, yet forever anchored in the timeless truth that some lives, lived with purpose and crowned with wisdom, become as eternal as the flowing of the Nile itself. If this journey through ancient history has moved you, touched your soul, or sparked your curiosity about the timeless stories that shaped our world, please take a moment to like this video, share it with others who appreciate the profound beauty of the past, and subscribe to fall asleep to history. Let these timeless tales find new hearts just like yours. Together, we can keep the memories of great souls like Ramses the Great alive for generations yet to come, ensuring that their wisdom, their triumphs, and their humanity continue to inspire and guide us through the gentle embrace of history's eternal embrace. Sweet dreams, dear listener. May the legacy of the great Pharaoh watch over your rest as he once watched over ancient Egypt, with wisdom, protection, and eternal peace.